Hi again guys, and welcome to lesson 7 of Mastering Hard Surface. Like last lesson, this is also another free lesson because I wasn't fully happy with the number of objects that were completed in the last lesson, and I also wanted to give you guys an opportunity to request some of your own ideas, and I've tried to include those in this lesson. So there's a few, I wouldn't exactly say advanced or complex objects, but they have the appearance of being complex, and I'm going to run you through how to create these just like last lesson, one by one, and I'm going to highlight some of the different methods and tools you can use to achieve these effects. So they're all relatively quick to do, but there is quite a good range here. And then lastly, I'll just show you how to, somebody asked me to finish off what it would be like to inset some text. Now usually I probably wouldn't do it this way, but for the sake of just knowing how to do it, I think it's extremely useful to know how to do type and work with type. So I'm just going to run you through kind of some of the topological theory behind when you're working with text. Alright, we'll just get started. You can see on the left here I've got a couple of knurled details, and we're going to construct that by starting with a single plane, creating the shape, and then we're going to bend it around the object, just like I've done quite a few times in the past. Alright, let's get started. Now, just like everything else I've always tried to teach, the easiest way to understand something and to achieve something complex is to break it down into its most simple part. And when you've got something like knurled details like this, you have to understand it's the exact same piece of geometry, just simply tiled a few times. So it doesn't, even though the end result appears a little bit complex, it's actually quite simple to set up. So to get started, we're just going to go from the front, and I'm just going to create a simple plane. I'm not going to bother aligning it to the center or anything. I'm just going to try and get through these objects as quickly and precisely as possible. So firstly, you want to make sure that it's square, obviously, and then I'm just going to convert that to an editable poly. The next thing I want to do is rotate it 45 degrees so that it's aligned correctly. You can see I've got angle snaps on, and there's an angle by default set to 5 degrees. You can change that wherever you want, to whatever number you want, just by going over the angle snap toggle and right clicking it. So later in the course there is going to be some things that do require some pretty specific angles to rotate objects on, and it's this option here in the degrees that we're going to change. But for now it's perfectly fine. So I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees, and the next thing I want to do is after doing that is I want to go in and reset the X form on the object, because when you rotate that like that, you're rotating the pivot of the object as well, and when you go to move it locally, you'll see now that the pivot is on the wrong angle. You can get around this by undoing that and going into the element and rotating the element 45 degrees, and now you can see that the angle is still correct on the pivot. But when you're working quickly, rather than doing that, I usually just find myself resetting the X form on objects enough to not worry about doing it on an element level. Okay, with this single polygon now created, I'm just going to select the inside, and first, sorry, let me just assign a material to this. And I'm just going to bevel it out. You'll notice I've left everything on those settings pretty straightforward, because now I'm going to go to the scale, and I'm just going to bring that in. I'm going to right click and convert to vertice, like we've done in the past, and then I'm just going to weld this. It's at this point where you can define how far out you want your knurled detail to go, but I'm just going to kind of keep it not exactly 45 degrees out, but enough where it's noticeable. The next step is going to involve changing where the pivot on the object is, so that when we clone this object, we're able to snap it to the borders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the hierarchy tab, I'm going to select effect pivot with snap on, and this is where it's a good idea to, you'll see here in the snaps options box, once right clicking that, you can turn on and off vertex snapping. So I've got that on. So now I'm affecting the pivot, and I'm going to move the pivot. Sorry, let me just turn on the snaps. And when I do that, it's going to naturally move. Sorry, just before I was showing you on the grid and snap settings, but it should be in here. So with our pivot now aligned to this corner piece, the next thing I want to do is duplicate the object down. And then rather than rotating everything again, what I can do is just rotate that into place. And depending on how high I want the knurled details to go, I can just keep doing that. So with this object here, I can just go down again. And down again like so. Now we've got a tileable piece of geometry. So I'm just going to go down a couple more times. And now what I want to do is to even off this top area, I need to delete these top two polygons. So I'm going to go into polygon mode and select these top two faces and delete them. Now I'm going to do the same again for the bottom. At this point, we've built the basic structure that we're going to bend around, but we first need to duplicate the object to the left. So I'm just going to attach all these objects using the attach box here. And now when I duplicate it, and I've still got that snap enabled, you'll see that I can make as many as I want. I'm going to stick to using copy, and I'm going to make the number of copies 35. Because we've already got one here, that's going to equal 36 copies in total. And now you can see we've built a pretty basic structure for which we're going to bend around. So I can turn snap off at this point. And now in the attach options box, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the top here and just drag over all of these. You can use Control A, so you can see if I've got just one selected. Using Control A will select all of them. So with all of these now attached together, we just need to bend them. So I'm going to use a bend modifier. I'm going to set the axis to X. I'm going to, oops, sorry. Sometimes you just need to experiment with that. I think I said in a previous lesson it's always pretty unlucky with whether or not it works. So in this case, I'm going to go to -90 on the angle. And then using Alt, which when you drag over a slider box and you don't have anything selected, you'll notice that it goes up at a higher value sometimes than you need for accuracy's sake. So in this particular case, 365 is the exact angle that it needs to snap. And you can see we're moving up in 1 increments. But if, oh sorry, in 0.5 increments. But if I hold Alt now, you can see now that that can go up by 0.05. So I'm just going to leave it at 365 and collapse this object. The next thing I need to do is I need to go in and select all the vertices, because you'll notice that we haven't snapped any of these. These are all single elements. They're not actually attached together. So I'm going to go in, attach those. You should be able to see the before and after number here drop. And now we're ending up with 504 vertices. And all those borders, the only borders we've got visible are up the top here. So at this stage, the next step is to go in and add the hardness to these so that when we smooth it, it's not turning into little blobs. So I'll just show you there. Right now, we don't have enough edge loops defining those pointy bits. So I'm going to go to edge mode, and I'm going to select everything but the border edges. And what I'm going to do after that, and this is totally up to you guys depending on how hard you want your object to appear, is I'm just going to chamfer off these edges. What you're left with is some pretty ugly geometry in the center here, but I've never really worried about this because when you're using a turbo smooth, like I said earlier in the course, and for those who haven't seen the actual full course, I do explain that when you're working with polygons, it doesn't matter if you've got triangles or n-gons or octagons or anything like that, as long as you're putting a turbo smooth on, because at the end of the day, when you do apply that turbo smooth, you're ending up with quads anyway. So you can see here, we've got a big open face, but as soon as I turn on turbo smooth, if you watch what happens, it fixes all that. And now we've got perfectly evenly distributed polygons. And it looks pretty good. So now the last thing to do really is to go into the top here and just extrude this out. And using our regularize tool, I'm just going to apply that. And it requires a little bit of trial and error about how big you scale this, because you'll notice now if I put Turbo Smooth on and scale in and out, it's totally up to you how you want this to terminate up the top. But if you wanted it to look like it was going straight from these pointy bits to a circular bit, what we're going to do is we're just going to add a couple more edge loops going up here so we can see what we're working with. And now smooth that. So you can see if I just go from below here, now I want to select these edge loops up the top, and using Turbo Smooth and Show End Result turned on, if I hit R now, when I cycle through, you can see I'm cycling through the different axes that I can use. So when I use all of them at once, you can see I can scale it in one direction, but that's not what I want to do. So I want to make sure that only the overall scale is available, and then I'm just going to shrink the object, and it can bug out a little bit. That's just a 3ds Max bug. I'm just going to make it the exact size I want and pull things down a little bit here. And now from above we end up with a nice clean knurled detail. At that point I can just go in over the top here, do whatever I want. And cap that off. And there you go. If I want, I can also add some symmetry to this underneath. And I just need to make sure that when I'm doing that, we're just up here. So now you'll notice I'm not fully capping off that bit of symmetry, because what I want to do is I want to weld these two together. So I'm going to collapse that. Sorry, bridge these two together. I'm going to collapse that, and now using the bridge tool, if I zoom in here, I'm just going to bridge these two. And we're left with a hard edge on the center there. And you can't tell. So that's the first piece I wanted to show you. And in theory, this should be able to work pretty much with everything. Right at the end, you might want to go into the hierarchy tab again and just center your pivot. But technically, if you have any kind of tileable pattern, you can bend it around, and even if you wanted to have like angled riveting on the inside of here, you can do anything. It applies universally. Okay, so next up, we've got another piece of geometry here that's got some knurling, but in a slightly different way. These are more kind of vertical knurls. So we'll get on to that now. So the next piece, the first step we're going to do is we're going to create a cylinder. Now, depending on how many knurled insets you want, you're going to have to go in and adjust the number of sides on the cylinder. In this particular instance, I'm using 80, and you can see how we don't have the exact same amount there, but we'll get there in a second. So the first thing I want to do is go in and define the shape of the overall object at this point in time. So I'm going to convert it to an editable poly, and then using bevel, I'm just going to drag out a bit of geometry, and you'll notice sometimes I do that just to give myself this bit of geometry to work with. And now I'm going to bring it up. I didn't mean to go in there, it's got to be completely vertical. Cool. Now I can delete that top face. Now the next thing I want to do is, sorry, I'll just bring this up just a little bit. and hide unselected. Just apply a bit of a correct shader to it. Alright, so the next step, we want to go in and we want to inset these knurls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one edge around the object, I'm going to ring it and then loop it using Control W then Control E. And I'm going to use the extrude options box to create the initial insets. Depending on how wide you want your knurls, this is at the point where you probably should adjust that, but just keep in mind that when you go smaller here, that will also reflect what's happening. So don't try and get any pinches. And I'm just going to go a little bit deeper. Okay, so up the top now, you can see we've got open surface, but down the bottom, we've still got a cap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Edit Poly Mode. In the polygon selection, I'm going to delete this bottom face. And you can see now we're left with this face here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shift drag this down, and I'm going to do that once more. Now, at this point, you could probably go in and add the hardness to your knurls. So what I'm going to do is, it's a really cool feature. In the modify selection, there's this similar box that you can tick. And what that does is it selects edges and vertices that I don't understand exactly how the algorithm works. Sometimes if your object's not completely symmetrical, it won't work as well. But I think it bases it on a couple of factors like the edge length and its angle in relation to the overall axis of where the object is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this single edge here, and in modify selection, I'm just going to hit similar. And now you can see it's selected that exact same edge, preventing us from, what this is good for is when you don't want to have to go in and model just one of these insets and then rotate it around 360 degrees. This just makes things a lot quicker because we can work on the entire object at once. So with that edge selected, I'm going to hit Control W, and that's going to ring the selection. And now I'm going to go in and add some hardness using Connect. I'm going to set 2 segments, and I'm just going to drag this out towards the edge. Now down the bottom here, you'll notice we don't have any hardness defining this top part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to right click and reduce those back to 1 and 0 and 0. And now using the same technique I've taught earlier in the class, is I'm going to hit C to make edge constraint turned on, and I'm just going to drag this down and then drag it up a little bit, because sometimes this inset isn't perfectly vertically flat. You can do that if you want, but if you don't want to, I find when it is just a little bit higher up, it can produce a slightly different effect. Okay, so there's one little problem. We've got a nice edge flow and topology happening here, but we don't have the ability to select the entire loop if we want to go in later and define the hardness of this inside knurl. So what I'm going to do to make that easier is, and we could technically just leave this right now and just go to modify and select similar, and then you could chamfer this if you wanted. But I'm also going to show you if I'm going to select this edge here, I'm going to hit similar for that. Then I'm going to loop it, and I'm going to connect this. And that leaves us with a four-sided face here. So at this point, down the bottom here, you'll notice that it's not completely circular. Because we've got one large flat area and then a bunch of smaller polygons, this will not smooth exactly perfect. So what you can do to get around that is I can delete this and go to this base object and hit regularize. And you can see it's slightly ruined the overall shape. Sometimes it does that. I think what you can do to fix that is you can select the border and cap it. And then when you select that polygon and regularize, nope, it's still doing it. And that's because edge constraint was turned on, sorry. So now I'm just going to try one more time. You can see it kind of wigs out a little bit. Weird. That's 3ds Max for you. It's not working exactly like I thought it would be. So I'm going to try and go in, and I'm going to select these 2 vertices and select similar for those, and then just connect them. Now we've got a full loop selected. Hopefully this works. It's still, usually it will evenly distribute those. Once again, when I'm working on this course, I'll rehearse things a few times, then when I go to actually do the recording, it just doesn't work as I expect it to. Okay, so in order to fix this, I'm just going to collapse the X-form of the object just in case. And I'm going to go to that border now, and just to make things a little bit easier to tell what's going on, I'm just going to drag out an edge loop here, and I'm going to select this ring and then use the regularize tool, and you can see if it does wig out like this for you, it shouldn't actually do this, but I do think it's important that if little bugs come up that do happen in Max, I show you how to fix them. What you can do is bring up the angle snaps toggle and change it from 5 to 1 degrees. And now when you rotate, it should eventually just click exactly where it needs to be. Now we can delete this outside edge, and at the base here we're back to having a perfect circular object. And if we decided to continue down, when we smooth this object now, it's going to be perfectly smooth and you're not going to get little bugs and things like that happening. So I'm going to put 2 smooths on that. Now you can see that we've got the bottom sorted. Just cap this off. But for the top, we need to do things a little bit differently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this border. Once again, I'm going to shift drag it up and then scale it in. Now you could technically just leave it like this depending on what you want to do, and then scale it in a little bit more, and then once more, and then use the regularize tool. And that will produce a specific type of knurling. So if I go up the top here and add some hardness to that, you can see it produces a pretty cool result. But you can also do things a little bit differently. If I just go back here, when I go to the border, if I drag this up, I can regularize this shape also. And now when I bring that in, and I'm going to go in and add that same level of hardness that I had here, using the two edges in connect mode, and that will produce a slightly different result. So depending on what your goal is, you can do it either way. I'll just run through and do it once more. So you scale it in a little bit. You can see we've got enough geometry there, and then once more, sorry, and then it's then that you can do that regularize script. And all the topology, it might not be perfect, but it gets the job done. And from this point you can go in and then, like I always like to do, just add a little bit more detail. So there you go, it's a nice perfectly clean knurled surface, and it's as low res as it can possibly be, keeping in mind that you may need to continue on that surface and you don't want it to appear edgy. And that's the best way I know how to do these types of details. So we'll just go on to the next object now. So this next object may appear quite simple, but there's a couple of little steps required in order to not get the pinching that you would usually see around the edge of where this extrusion happens. So let me just isolate this object, and we'll just get running through in how to create it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to start with a cylinder. So I'm just going to start with a cylinder here, and I've got 20 sides on it. Depending on what other details you have on this cylinder will determine how many sides you want. But I think in general you want to try and keep, the purpose of this is to show you how to create a extrusion like this on a low res surface. So I'm just going to delete the sides of the polygon. I'm just going to delete back here also. Okay. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create two loops along the side of the object. And now from here, what I can do is I can select these polygons and delete them. Now I want to go in and select these border edges and bring them up. And then I'm going to flatten them. Because we're just getting in the way here, I'm just going to remove this bit of geometry. And I'm going to create two more loops running down the inside just so we've got a little bit more even distribution of polygons. I'm going to do the same for this side. And depending on what you have towards the edge here, I wouldn't recommend adding more loops than you need, so I'm going to get rid of those. Holding control while hitting remove there. Now I'm going to go in and select these back edges and drag them up. And getting these two edges, you can see they're not welded. I'm just going to drag over these two and weld them up. And when I've done that, because I didn't drag these up at the exact same height, I just want to make sure that when I do that, I go in and re-flatten that using the Y button. So from here, now we can figure out how to get this shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all these edges here and just select them exactly how I've done. And we're just going to chamfer. Depending on how hard you want this will also determine how big you go in the chamfer. But for our little test here, I'm just going to keep it this big. So up the back here, you'll notice that we've created a couple of triangles. So what I'm going to do just to quickly make this a little bit cleaner is just cut an edge along the outside just to clean that up. And now if we ever wanted to, and I'll show you in a second, if I just get rid of that inside loop. Now if I ever want to go in and add some edge loops along here, we've got a nice flowing bit of topology. So up the top here isn't that important, but I'll just cap this off. What I like to do is I like to go in and select these two edges and then just grab this whole thing and then inset it. I'm going to delete this polygon back here. And now I like to grab all these edges up here and flatten them and just pull them back. So now you can see I'm just selecting these back edges and I'm just going to drag those up. If you do get a little bit of an overlap here, feel free to just undo that. Because this surface at the top here is perfectly flat, you don't need to worry so much about the spacing between these vertices. Just as long as they're good, you shouldn't be able to tell by eye what's happening. So the next thing I can do is now I can add an edge loop up the top here. So I'm going to use the options box to do that and just level that to 1. And using the same method I was showing you earlier in the lesson, we're going to turn on edge constraint toggle and drag that up and then back down. And now we can see what this looks like smoothed. Now you can see it looks pretty good, but there's one little problem we're getting here, and that's whenever you have a curved cylinder, something extruding out of that, you end up with this bit of pinching here. So to fix that, it's just a simple solution, and this is why I wanted to show you this piece, because if you go in and select these vertices, using show and result, I'm just going to drag down. And what this does is it helps minimize that. Sorry, I just was dragging down with edge constraint turned on. And now you can see when I drag down there, The pinching is noticeable, but you're just minimizing that as much as possible. And usually when you go and render something like this, it's not fully noticeable. So once again, on the edge here, you've got a 5-sided point, but if I turn off isoline display, it's nice and quadrangular. Let me just apply a shader to that. If it's still causing you a little bit of grief, you can always go in and select all of these and just move them in a little bit. And this should also further reduce that effect happening. So unless you're seeing this from the absolute most extreme of angles, you should be able to get away with this, because there's quite often lots of small details that require this type of extrusion. But you don't want to go in and have a 50-sided cylinder, so you're minimizing that effect. So that's the topology required for something like this. You can see I haven't worried so much about the top here, but that wasn't the point of this piece. Okay, moving on. This next piece, once again, seems a little bit complex, but it's actually extremely simple to set up. As usual, we've got some weird 5-sided faces, but when you see what it looks like smooth, they all produce pretty nice flowing topology, which is great for later on if you wanted to go in and say, for example, let me just duplicate this, collapse it at this level. Then you could go in and you've got loops that you can select here and possibly connect and add hardness to if you wanted. Just want to re-smooth this. You get that effect happening, which looks pretty cool. So in order to do this, what I'm going to do is firstly, I'm just going to set up the piece that I'm going to actually inset this circular bit into. And now if you look really closely, you'll see that this doesn't smooth perfectly fine, but when you're looking at some of the character models and things like that I've done that aren't so industrial and you want more of a sci-fi soft design shape to it, this works really well. So what I'm going to do is you can base this on any kind of inset you want, but I'm just going to steal this one that we've already got here, because basically this is just creating a plane and dragging in a little bit of a inset there. And I'm just going to flatten this off and drag out again. So this is the starting shape for our object. You can see it's quite simple. It's just a flat plane with a couple of insets. And when we smooth that, that's the result it's giving off. So to get the circle in, I'm just going to take the turbo smooth off, and we need a couple of edge loops here. So the first one I'm going to connect. I'm just going to go into the options and make sure that the settings are reset. So we're going to connect one down the center, and we're going to connect another down the side. The next step is actually getting the perfectly circular edge loop